talking about are the colonists' reasons for rebellion, the learning outcomes for today. There are 3 of them. You should be able to describe why the Crown wanted to start taxing the colonists. Number 2, you should be able to describe the different taxes that are levied on those colonists and how it affects them. And number 3, be able to understand the reasons behind the creation of the First and the Second Continental Congress. So let's get this thing started. First thing, French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, the French and the Indians versus the British. Now, the British is also going to encompass colonists here. The British Crown is going to be defending those colonists. It ends in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, and the Treaty of Paris is going to be the first one. There's going to be many of them that we're going to talk about. So the ending of this 7 Years' War in 1763 is going to really allow the British to claim a whole lot of territory. With the French losing, they have to give up Canada and almost everything that they had east of the Mississippi River. Now, the Spanish also that had aligned themselves with the French are going to lose territory here. The British are going to get Florida from the Spanish, and the natives are also going to lose a pretty significant chunk of land here. Ultimately, it's going to lead us to the Proclamation Line of 1763. As you can see here, right along the Appalachian Mountains is where there's going to be this Proclamation Line. Now, the Crown itself is going to tell the colonists, look, at this point, you cannot cross this line. Okay, you can't go through here into Native American territory anymore. Well, the colonists pretty much ignore this altogether. There's nobody there to enforce it, so they just continue on with their expansion as they had before. The French and Indian War itself leaves Britain ultimately broke. Their national debt is going to be more than doubled. That money tree that they once had is going to be gone. So the Crown itself has to figure out a way to tax or get that money back. And they're going to do that through various numbers of taxes. Okay? The hope is that they can start to repay themselves because they feel like they've had to defend those colonists and the colonists should have to pay them back for that. So ultimately, King George wants to lower that debt through those taxes. The first of those acts is the Sugar Act. It's a tax on foreign-made molasses, and it ultimately cuts the tax in half, but it only really affects the traders and the merchants. So the vast majority of the colonists themselves, it doesn't really affect them. They don't even really know that there's a tax that is going on. And it's cutting the tax in half, and the hope was that these people would actually start to pay that tax versus evade that tax. And the colonists believe that Parliament really has no right to tax them. This goes back to the British Bill of Rights in the 1600s, that no taxation without representation. So the colonists are going to get together, they're going to throw a fit, and they're going to rebel. And ultimately it's going to lead to the repealing of that Sugar Act. The Crown, though, is not done. The Stamp Act, a year later, 1765, is going to start taxing printed items, wills, newspapers, anything like that, anything, playing cards, for example. They're going to see this stamp right here, oh, the fatal stamp. It's going to be on everything, and it's going to be a visible tax, meaning everyone is going to be able to see that. It's going to affect those colonists directly, and it's going to outrage them on top of it. And one of the first rebel groups that's going to develop is the Sons of Liberty. They start to organize boycotts, and a year later, 1766, the Stamp Act is repealed. So you should be able to see a pattern that is developing here. With the Sugar Act, the colonists boycott, they get upset, then the tax gets repealed. The Stamp Act, the colonists boycott, they rebel, the tax gets repealed. So they're starting a tradition here. They think that they're going to be able to get away with it simply by rebelling or boycotting those taxes. Here's some members of the Sons of Liberty. You have Sam Adams, you have John Adams, future president, John Hancock, and Paul Revere. These guys should sound pretty familiar to you, and we'll talk about Paul Revere a little bit later today. Now, the Townsend Act, 1767. This is going to tax goods that's brought into the colonies, specifically a tax on tea. There's other stuff that is going to tax as well, paint and some other things, but for our purposes, by the time that it really starts to become a problem, the tax is still going to be on tea. So it's going to turn into the tea tax, really, in about 1770. The colonists, again, are going to organize a boycott because they've been conditioned over and over that they have a tax, they'll boycott, and then it'll get repealed, okay? And ultimately, for the Crown, it's going to cost exponentially more to enforce this tax than it is to actually what they're getting from the colonists. They're only going to get a few £100s out of those colonists versus costing hundreds of thousands of pounds to try and enforce it. By 1770, the colonists, right in about the middle of this Townsend Act, are going to start to really start mob protesting these taxes. They're going to be outside this Boston Customs House where there are British soldiers sitting there waiting, kind of protecting the crown governor. And there's this back and forth between these colonists and these British troops. One of the accounts is that these colonists itself are very rowdy. They have taken snowballs and they're throwing them at these British soldiers. And there's this back and forth that's going to happen that is ultimately going to end in tragedy. Someone yells fire. No one really knows who. 5 colonists are killed. Now you can decide for yourself if you would call 5 people dying a massacre. But the first martyr of this revolutionary time period is a guy by the name Crispus Attucks. He's African American from Boston. This is a lithograph by Paul Revere. You can see here, it looks like the British are just openly firing on innocent people. Okay, this is not the case at all. These colonists were very much in rebellion at this point. And Paul Revere kind of says, you give me the picture, I'll give you the war that you want. Okay. Now, the Boston Tea Party itself, realistically, even though that there's this huge disaster of a Boston massacre, tensions between the crown and the colonists are really going to be kind of going away for a few years. By 1773, however, the British East India Company is failing. The crown is trying to keep them afloat. So what they're going to do is pass a law that allows the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the people. They can cut out the colonial merchants, which of course is going to upset them. So 1773, there are going to be a multitude of Boston townspeople that are going to dress up like Native Americans and dump all the British East India Company tea into the harbor, 18,000 pounds of it. The one thing that you don't want to mess with the colonists is their tea. It's the most popular drink for them at this time period. You can kind of see here's a depiction of these colonists dressed up like Native Americans. One of the big things, though, they were only supposed to dump the tea. They weren't supposed to steal anything. Okay, it was just dumping of the tea. And here's another painting of the time period. You can kind of see them dumping the tea into the harbor. Now, the Intolerance Acts. Right after this, King George is going to be outraged at the dumping of all of this tea. He is going to shut down Boston Harbor, issue a Quartering Act, which allows the British soldiers to be housed in people's homes and empty businesses. And Boston is going to be placed under martial law. And the only way that they were saved was other colonies were importing food to Boston itself. General Gage, as you can see here, he was placed as the new governor, and he's the one that does place Boston under martial law. All of these things lead us to the First Continental Congress. This is where we have 56 delegates, 12 of the 13 colonies. Georgia is a little bit slow, so they don't attend. They get together, and you can kind of see the center here, George Washington. George Washington is this type of guy. He's taller than everybody else. He's always dressed in his best clothing and doesn't say very much. He's kind of a mysterious figure for the colonists at this point. So once they meet here in Philadelphia, they're really going to decide a few things. One of the major things is we need to prepare ourselves. We need to start to develop a militia. And they're going to start to recruit these Minutemen, okay, which are just like everybody else. They're like you and me. They're not trained. These guys are farmers. They're really nothing more than that. They have a weapon to hunt with. That's about it. They're not very good or trained. Really, ultimately, should be no match for these trained redcoats if the time comes. Now, the early battles. Lexington and Concord. You may remember the famous Paul Revere, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Take a look at this clip, and it should refresh your memory.
Hey, they're coming. Yeah, British. Later. Sorry. Okay.
It would be so much easier if they had cell phones back then, wouldn't it? Really, these are the first battles of the Revolution. The colonists are going to lose tragically at Lexington. However, on the Redcoats' march to Concord, this is where they start, the colonists itself start a counterattack. They set up an ambush at Concord, and really this is going to be a new type of warfare. It's almost like guerrilla warfare today, where it's a hit-and-run type tactic. Prior to this, it was line up and fire at your enemy, and you fired at the people on the ground, not the officers on the horses in the back. So it's a brand new thing, and when the colonists break this out, the Redcoats are going to be caught completely off guard. And you can see here, the Redcoats start here right about Boston. They march all the way up here to Lexington. They're going to start to push the colonists back, and they're really up here heading to Concord to get the stores of weapons that they know are there. But before they get there, the colonists itself have already cleaned out. They're going to beat the Redcoats all the way back down into Charleston. So there's going to be a 1-1 after this. You're going to lose Lexington but win Concord. The Lexington and Concord battles are going to lead us to the Second Continental Congress. This is at a point where these delegates are going to again meet in Philadelphia, and the question is going to be raised, are they going to fight and become independent, or ultimately should they attempt to reconcile with the crown? And they're really split down the middle, but they're preparing just in case. So what they're going to do is name George Washington as their commanding general of the colonial forces, the colonial army. A little bit after this is going to lead us to a battle at Bunker Hill. It's going to be the deadliest battle of this revolution. Strangely enough, it's before the Declaration of Independence is even sent. So the Olive Branch petition after the Battle of Bunker Hill is going to be sent to the king in kind of hopes of saying, look, we really feel tied to you guys. We don't want to necessarily break away. We're perfectly fine being British citizens, but we don't like not having that representation. So if you can allow us the representation, allow us to govern ourselves and not levy these taxes on us, we don't have a problem still being British citizens. So that's going to get sent off to the king, and ultimately the king is going to reject that Olive Branch petition and is going to start to set up a blockade of the eastern seaboard. Now the delegates have a decision they have to make. They are going to vote to have the right to be free and independent states. Jefferson is going to start to draft the Declaration of Independence and then sent to the king and saying ultimately all men are created equal. And we all know now that not all men are created equal. Immigrants, Native Americans, and especially slaves or free African Americans and women were not even considered at this point. The Declaration itself is adopted July 4th, 1776, and this is the point now that the colonists have to fight to keep their independence. So let's recap. Number 1, describe the reasons behind the crown's taxation of the colonists. Number 2, you should be able to describe those different taxes that are levied on the colonists and how it affected their lives. And number 3, what were the reasons behind the creation of the First and Second Continental Congress? And also keep in mind what we are going to do throughout the Revolution. So I hope you've enjoyed this screencast. If you need any help, let me know, and we'll see you next time.